The second day of our week-long workshop is about to start in a few minutes. Here are the few reminders before we officially begin. Everyone is requested to have their microphones turned off throughout the entire program. You may only turn it on once you are permitted to do so. Each of you is encouraged to open their cameras and listen attentively to our resource speaker and facilitator. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Yung bewang ni Bugoy sa isang kawayan. Tapos, so si Bugoy, hindi na siya nakahawla, pero nakatali siya ngayon dun sa kawayan at dun lang siya naikot-ikot sa kawayan na yon. Tapos, medyo nanghihina na si Bugoy, kaya sabi ko dun sa pinsan ko, bakit hindi niyo pa siya pakawalan? So sabi nung pinsan ko, hindi na daw nila pwedeng pakawalan si Bugoy. Although na-try daw nila, nung ginawa nila yon, papatayin siya ng mga kasamahan niya at mamamatay daw siya dun sa gubat kasi hindi na marunong si Bugoy na maging normal. So, nitong huling nadalaw ko si Bugoy, dinalang ko siya ng tinapay, tapos tinatanong ng mga pinsan ko kung gusto ko na siyang ampunin. So sabi ko, hindi naman po pwede, hindi ko naman siya pwedeng ampunin. So yun, nagpaalam ako kay Bugoy. So, meron ako ngayong dalawang ibon. So, si Laya at si Tinig. So, si Laya at si Tinig, nanganak yung best friend ko. So, hindi na nila pwedeng, ayaw na nila dun sa birds. So, ang ginawa ko na lang siya, tapos pinangalanan kong si Laya at si Tinig. Tinanong ko din yung best friend ko kung pwedeng pakawalan ko na lang kasi hindi ako marunong mag-alaga ng ibon. Sabi sa akin, hindi raw pwede. Kasi daw, hindi na nga daw magsusurvive sa labas. So, sa ngayon, nasa akin si Laya at si Tinig at nandito kami sa San Miguel, Santo Tomas, Batangas. So, hindi na sila pwedeng lumaya dahil hindi na sila sanay sa kalayaan. Dahil ikamamatay nila ang hindi nila nakasanayan na kalayaan. So, ano yung importance nito? Ano yung importance ng pagsasama-sama o pagtitipon-tipon natin ngayon? So, dapat masanay tayo sa kalayaan at dapat pinapractice natin siya. Kasi kung hindi natin siya normal na ginagawa, nawawala siya sa atin. Hindi na tayo nasasanay. At ikamamatay natin yung sarili nating kalayaan. Kagaya ng nakikita na natin ngayon dun sa lipunan natin, di ba? Kaya nagpapasalamat ako sa FTL dahil naisip nila to, dahil sila talaga yung nag-organize nito. Nagpapasalamat ako ng lubos sa aking si Roy Montenegro kasi palagi niyang inaasikaso yung mga ganitong bagay beyond dun sa mga ginagawa niya. Kasama ng buong team niya. Nagpapasalamat ako sa BSE English, sa mga project heads na naggawa nito. Kay Dr. Vivian B. Titular, kasama natin siya ngayong hapon. So salamat Doc Dean. Alam niyo naman kung gaano ka-busy ang ating Dean, pero palagi niya tayong sinusuportahan, palagi siyang nandyan. So thank you po Doc. And of course, thank you very much, Sir John Emmanuel M. Alonso. Salamat, Sir. Ang mga estudyanteng to, estudyante sila ngayon, kalimitan sa kanila nasa third year na. Pero Sir, sila kasi yung mga susunod na hawak ng mga maliliit na school paper dito sa Batangas. And hopefully, hanggang sa Manila o hanggang saan man sila makarating. So ibig sabihin, yung inyo pong ibabahagi ngayon sa kanila, ay madadala nila at maipapasa nila sa mga susunod na mga susulat sa dyaryo. So sana po ay maipaabot ko sa inyo or sana maramdaman nyo na ang aking sobrang pasasalamat dahil pinaunlakan nyo po kami for this afternoon. Ayun, and then salamat ng marami sa Faith College of Education, sa mga nagpunta dito kahit na BE-Ed sila or BPE sila, nandito sila dahil gusto nila matuto ng pagsasalita para sa kalayaan. So salamat sa inyo at mapagpalayang hapon sa ating lahat.
Again, a very heartwarming opening remarks from our very own Chair of College of Education. Palakpakan naman natin si Miss J. Thank you po for that wonderful pieces of advice, Miss J. And I will leave I will leave to our attendees to contemplate about the short but sweet pieces of advice you've given to us. Now, alam ko na you are all excited to meet our resource speaker and facilitator for today. And thus, without further ado, here is Mr. Manuel Garcia, the Public Relations Officer of FTL, to introduce to you our speaker and facilitator for today.
Thank you, Karen. Our resource speaker is an undergraduate student of De La Salle University. He has been a campus journalist for over 11 years, during which he represented Central Visayas in the National Schools Press Conference twice as an editorial writer, placing fourth in 2017. In 2018, he joined De La Salle, the official English student publication of De La Salle University, as a news writer and is now serving as its editor-in-chief. Let us all welcome with a big hand our very own speaker, Mr. Jan Emmanuel M. Alonso.
Hello, everyone. uh, it's my honor to be here. Really, I'm very flattered that you accepted me being here. It's a great opportunity for me to speak to you, and I of course wouldn't pass up the chance. So thank you for having me, and thank you for those words. Now, as you may know, I'm here to talk about editorial writing. So yeah, I guess now is a time to start, as any. Allow me to share my screen first. My bad, I don't know how screen sharing in Google Meet works. There. So unfortunately, they cannot see everyone, but I am on my file, so I hope you can see me nonetheless. All right, so today I'll be sharing to you the techniques, mostly technical stuff really, on how to create or craft your editorial. So here we'll be learning about fundamentals of editorial writing. Now, it's not mostly about writing technicalities, but also how to craft your argumentation in a way that is effective for an editorial. But first, let's clarify some terms. So I have here an image of the first page of our opinion section. So some of you may be familiar with these already, some of you may not be. I'm informed that while most of you are in the third year of college, some may be from lower years. So let's just brush up on these terms. So first, you have there the editorial cartoon, right? Usually that's a representation, that's the artist's interpretation of the editorial, of the opinion expressed in the editorial. But sometimes for other publications, it may be the artist's personal opinion on the issue. So that's part of the reason why in some papers you may observe that what's expressed in the editorial isn't what's expressed, or it doesn't exactly match the cartoon. That's because some publications give their artists the freedom to interpret it in the way they wish, or give their own opinion. But for our publication, at least for the Lasallian, we prefer that what's expressed in the cartoon matches what is expressed in the editorial. So what is the editorial anyway? Well, the editorial basically is the opinion article that expresses the stand of the publication as a whole. It doesn't express the stand of just the editorial board, just any one writer. it expresses the stand of the paper as an organization. Now, that is in contrast to the column or op-ed being short for opposite the editorial page. Just a fun fact, because on the next page, um, on the page next to the editorial, those are mostly personal columns. So that's why it's opposite the editorial page or shortened to op-ed. So columns or op-eds, they're in contrast to the editorial, they're the personal opinion of the writer. So basically, while the editorial and the column both express opinions, the editorial is the opinion of the publication as a whole, while the column is the opinion of the writer personally. Now, I don't know if you've heard of this term, but sometimes, or maybe not even sometimes, a lot of the time, people, especially practitioners in the field, like to regard the editorial as the heart of the newspaper. And why? It's important that we look at this and we understand this because it underscores really the fact that the editorial fulfills and realizes the purpose of the paper. Now, news and journalism, really in general, doesn't just aim to deliver information, to entertain, or to relay facts. As Danilo Ara, I'm sure I expect you to know Mr. Ara, no? Renowned journalism academic. He says that journalism is information plus, information is facts plus analysis. So when we want to inform, we don't just provide facts. We also interpret those facts in a way that helps readers make sense of it. So this is where the editorial comes in, because while the news reports the facts, it's the editorial that makes sense of the facts and interprets the facts in their proper context. And in doing so, engages the readers and helps them mold their critical thinking. Because journalism isn't just a passive way of giving information. If you do that, journalism becomes merely as a fence-sitting practice, merely as something that gives information and let the readers decide. As a matter of journalistic philosophy, we argue that no, journalism actually has to mold its readers to be critical of what they're reading. And this is how, and through the editorial, is how we fulfill that role, is how we realize that goal. So that's why it's the heart of the newspaper, because through the editorial, we are able to materialize that objective. Now, speaking of editorials, there are actually various types of editorials. Different sources, different authors may give you varying numbers. Some even just classify editorials into 4. But I prefer this classification because it's much more detailed. Now, please do note that this isn't an exclusive list, and this is, again, this is just based on the categorization of one source. So it's not set in stone, so to speak. So now what I like about this is that it's more or less, it's the most exhaustive one I've seen, but it's not exclusive. So some editorials may take the form of more than one of these. So now let's just go through the 8 quickly. So first is an editorial information. It basically just explains a topic, which is why it isn't really very common. Because sometimes news organizations already do explainer articles or news features. So there's really very little need for an editorial that simply informs and explains. The most common are actually editorials of interpretation, criticism, argumentation, because they're the ones that really express the opinions of the paper. So an editorial of interpretation is one that interprets the implications of news. So, for example, a recent news, right, is the fact that, when Metro Manila mayors voted to shift NCR to MGCQ. So what are the implications of that medically, in terms of public health? What would that mean for the country or for Metro Manila? So when you interpret that, you're doing an editorial interpretation. An editorial criticism is when you point out the flaws of a policy or of an action. So when you're criticizing what's wrong, or you're directly pointing out what's wrong with that vote to shift Metro Manila to MGCQ, then you're doing an editorial of criticism. Now, an editorial of, let's go to argumentation first, because it's one of the most common. An editorial of argumentation is when you directly express whether you're for this issue or whether you're against this issue. So if a paper directly says that they support the shift to MGCQ because of these reasons, this and that, or whether they say that we oppose this issue because of these reasons. So they're arguing. So that's an editorial of argumentation. Now, the rest are less common, but they may nonetheless be existent. So we have an editorial of appreciation. It's basically just commending a person or organization or giving tribute to them. Say it's the birthday of, I don't know, it's Duterte's birthday, for example, and you have a pro Duterte paper commending him, paying tribute. Happy birthday, Mr. President, and you've done well in your job or whatever. So that's an editorial of appreciation. It's the newspaper or the news organization expressing their appreciation for this person. Or it may not even be, it may not have to be a person, it can be an organization. So perhaps for non-government organizations or for government institutions, they may be the subjects of editorials of appreciation. We have an editorial of entertainment. So it's basically just discussing an issue in a way that's lighthearted or satirical. Bottom line is it invokes humor. So now you have, and then since the what makes it an editorial of entertainment is the tone, then it can take the form in terms of content of other types of editorials as well. For example, it can also criticize while being humorous, so that would make it both criticism and entertainment. The next one is a mood editorial. I haven't exactly come across an example of this one, but it's basically when you don't argue for or against an issue, or you don't interpret a news, you just present a philosophy. So for example, if it's Valentine's and you're presenting the philosophy of what it means to love and what really is love. So that's, for some reason, that's what your paper chooses to talk about. So that's a mood editorial. Now, lastly, we have the special occasion editorial. It also interprets an event, but it focuses on why the event is important. We'll see examples of the common types of editorials later, but just to show you what the less common ones look like, I actually have an example of a special occasion editorial. Let me see if I can switch my screen sharing. Here. So what we have here is an editorial, special occasion editorial. So our paper celebrated our 60th anniversary last October 24. So that's 60 after 60. So what we talked about is, why is it important that we're celebrating our 60th anniversary? Why must the newspaper be jubilant about its 60th year? Why should the readers care that it's our 60th anniversary? So what we said was that it serves as a testament to our journalism principles that we will continue to uphold. And then at the end, we also said we reaffirm our commitment. So that's what we thought was the significance of our anniversary. And you can see that in this editorial of special occasion. Yeah. Now, going back to the presentation. So as you can see, because there are various types of editorials, that would mean there's basically a limitless range of topics that you can talk about. You can talk about novelty things, you can talk about important things, you can talk about light-hearted things, things that matter to your paper person, just to your paper, whatever is out there, you can basically uh, publish an interpretation or your opinion about it. But you have to take note that journalism doesn't exist in a vacuum. Journalism exists in its social context. So while there's a variety of topics, in our context, particularly in the Philippines, we are in a situation where we cannot afford to just talk about things that don't matter. So if we are to realize the potential of journalism, then we have to talk about things that matter for the people, for our readers. So, and that's why usually the most common are interpretation, criticism, and argumentation, because those are the ones that really give the social slash political, maybe even economic importance of news items or of relevant issues. So now we're done talking about the concept of an editorial. Let's look at how editorials are written. There. So there are quite a few. It's not really a lot. There are a few editorial writing conventions. The first is, I've summarized them into 4 themes. So the first is hook with the title. Basically, this convention is that your title should have no more than 3 words, because it doesn't look very. I think this originated as a matter of space, because in the early days of news was in print, right? And on a paper, space is limited, so you have to limit the title of your editorial. Which is why now in online-based news organizations, you may have longer editorials, and because of layouting software, space is less of a problem. It's easier to manage space now, but we've continued, some, or actually many editorial writers have continued following this convention to have no more than 3 words, just to have that quick effect, and that effect where you capture the stand of the editorial, or you capture the message in a way that's quick. And speaking of which, the title should, as I said, capture the message. It should reflect your general stand. So it's like saying, in no more than 3 words, summarize what you said in your editorial, or and make it in a way that's intriguing. That's just a tip. That's not really a convention, but write it in a way that's intriguing. Like when they read those 3 words in your title, it's best that they'd wonder, oh, that's something thought provoking. I wonder what this editorial is trying to say, and thus, because of that hook, they continue reading. So after the title, hook again with your intro. So the conventions here are that, 1, the introduction, the beginning paragraph, the introductory paragraph, should have a news peg. Now, a news peg is basically any generic statement, really, or any description that describes a recent issue. So it just lends relevance to your editorial. So have a news peg and state the general stand, meaning state a generic summary of your stand. The reason why it's best to follow this kind of convention, that you have to state the general stand. Of course, first of all, for the news peg, you have to understand that your readers should be aware of why you're writing the editorial in the first place. Perhaps they'd wonder when they're reading the article, you're writing this opinion about this topic, but why should I care? Why is it something you're writing about now? So when you add the news peg, that makes it relevant for the readers. So that's why it's important. Now, the generic summary, or the general statement of the stand, should be there just to hook your readers into what it is you're trying to say. I've seen editorials that drag on for quite a few paragraphs before they state their stand, before they state any semblance of opinion. I have an example. I wasn't able to include it in my slides, so let me again switch to another window. So here, sorry, that's not it. This is an editorial we published on March 26th. This was, to be honest, this was controversial, but what I want us to look at here is the structure. So as you can see in the first paragraph, what they did, they opened with, and also for the record, I wasn't involved in writing this, just so you know. Yeah, so they opened with an explanation. Okay, what happened? So because of COVID, we had ECQ, and then they suspended classes. And then there, in the second paragraph, they continued narrating events. So while they suspended classes, the student government conducted a survey. And then what were the details of the survey? So I don't like how this is structured because it takes so long before they actually, this is an editorial of criticism, because they criticize that survey. That survey was faulty, and they criticized that. But it took them so long to say that that's what they were trying to say. If I was a reader and I'm on the second paragraph and they're still narrating the events, my initial thoughts would be like, okay, so what are you trying to say? And then it drags on until it takes them really until the third paragraph to put any semblance of opinion. And in fact, this isn't even an opinion, it's just an observation. So the actual opinion here, the also too broad and unclear part, that comes at the last sentence of the third paragraph. And this isn't even the worst example. There are some examples of some editorials, not necessarily ours, but ones that tend to narrate the facts first before they get to the opinion. And what that makes, the effect of that is that it makes your editorial, or it makes the structure dragging at the beginning. So your readers would have to read through everything first before they have an idea of what you're trying to talk about. Whereas if you follow the structure here, let me return to my slides. If you follow the structure here at the beginning, the reader already gets an idea of what you're trying to say, so that later on, they can contextualize the facts that you narrate with the stand that you stated, and they can themselves form their opinions or form their own interpretation. They can themselves make the connections. They can connect the dots themselves as they read. So when you do this, you'd actually also be helping them develop their critical thinking. Next is to keep it simple. Discuss no more than 3 points. So when you're writing an editorial, sometimes there are a lot of things you want to talk about. For example, if you're writing an editorial about the vaccination program, so you can talk about problems with procurement, the lack of plans, and Duterte's public vaccination stunt. So there's basically a lot of angles really to how you can approach an issue. But if you try to address every angle that you can think of, that makes your editorial very complicated, and essentially, or in effect, it'll make it very long also. So we'll get to length later, but let's stick to complexity. So it's best to have no more than 3 points. So in fact, even 1 point is okay. 1 or 2, that's fine. And maybe even 3 points is more than enough. But 4 or more, that's definitely too much. Because again, as I said, it makes the editorial complicated. So it's like you're going to be all over the place when you're writing. Next is keep it concise. So this is a quote. It's not in verbatim because I don't remember the exact words anymore, but it was John Neri who said this in a conference I attended a while back. He said, an editorial should only be as long as it needs to be. if you look at PhilStar, the Philippine Star, its editorials are very short. I think it's only about 200 to 300. The Inquirer has about 400 to 5. And that's what we follow also in the Lasallian. 400 to 500 words is preferable. So at this length, we find that at this length, it gives us enough leeway to talk about things in a way that we can expound on them sufficiently, but not too long that it becomes dragging. So 400 to 500 words is okay. Now, it's important that, it's important that we understand these conventions because they make, these conventions are like general features of an editorial. So they're like general characteristics that make your article identifiable as an editorial. I mean, if I see these, then I can identify that the editorial follows the generic structure of editorial writing. But again, take note that these are just conventions, and conventions are really just common practices. They're just agreed on practices. They're not hard and fast rules. They're not supposed to be set in stone. So if you want to be creative with your editorial and you feel the need to break any one of these conventions, then go ahead. For example, if that editorial I showed you before, 60 after 60, the special occasion one, that didn't even reach 400 words. But it's we couldn't, we found that there was nothing more we could say. That was it. So even though it didn't reach our convention of 400 to 500, we had to break that convention because we've said what we had to say. Sometimes also, perhaps you can justify the need to discuss 4 points as long as your editorial still comes out well. You can break that convention. So basically, the bottom line here is that when you break conventions, you have to do it in a way that is effective. But it's still important for us to follow. To know at least, not necessarily follow, but to know the conventions, because one principle that I like to think about over and over, and this is something I attribute as a quote to our menagerie or our features editor. She said, you have to know the rules before you break them. So you have to understand what these conventions are, what they try to do before you circumvent those conventions. Because when you break conventions, it's usually to try to deliver your message more effectively. It it shouldn't be just as a matter of just because you feel like it. When you break conventions, it should be because it works better this way, or it works better when done another way. But you have to be sure that when you're trying to make it work better, it effectively really does work better. So that's why you have to understand conventions before you break those conventions. Um, so I've talked about of some of the structure here. For example, I've talked about the introduction. I've talked about discussing no more than 3 points. So let's talk more about structure. Let's delve more into that. So basically, it's just your standard introduction, body, conclusion. But for me, I follow a structure of presenting ideas. So what I do is establish, support, advocate. So in the introduction, I first establish the stand. So I immediately tell the reader what the editorial is talking about. So there I include the news peg, which again is a statement that makes the editorial seem relevant. And then I include a generic summary of the stand. So, because like I said earlier, it gives your readers an idea of what you're trying to talk about. Then next in the body, you support. So when you write the news spec, kasi it shouldn't be too long that it makes your opening paragraph like occupy half a page or something. No, the news peg is like just a short statement of what the issue is. So when you feel like you need to add more, then add that to your body. When you need to explain the news, explain the issue more, add that to your body. So that's where you provide more context of the news peg. And then, since what you stated in the introduction is only a generic summary, then in your body, that's where you expound on that stand. So what are the nuances of your stand? What are the complexities? Um, and what are your premises? What is your argumentation? Why do you take this stand? How can you support it? And at the last, you basically advocate. So in the conclusion, you can reiterate or restate your stand once again, and then you offer a suggestion, what should be done, what can be done, or you raise a call to action. You call on senators, they should pass this bill, or you call on the president, he should implement this policy. Or you yourself as a paper make a commitment. So if it's an editorial that, for instance, involves your paper directly, then you can make a commitment that this is what our paper is going to do. So let's look at this example. This is the editorial we published last November, if I'm not mistaken. The issue then was the red tagging of Lieutenant General Antonio Parlade. So let's look at how we followed that establish, support, advocate structure. So here, the opening paragraph, that's the entire news peg. Don't follow the path Kyle Colmenares took in the underground. So this is his quote, right, when he red tagged those celebrities. So here we describe what he did, that he was red tagging, he was throwing allegations all over the place. He was alleging that basically a lot of people had communist links or links to communist groups. So that's the news peg. That gives us that gives us a relevance, or that establishes why what we're talking about is relevant. So the generic summary here, in contrast to our convention to have the generic summary in the introduction, in the introductory paragraph, it's actually in the second paragraph. Now, if you must know, the first draft of this editorial had the generic summary in the first paragraph, but we opted to put it in the next paragraph because it made the first paragraph too long. So there, we understood that we knew the convention. We saw the need to break the convention because it would make the first paragraph too long. Like it looks like a big chunk if you look at it on print. So that's why, because of that need, we had to break the convention and put it in the second paragraph. But of course, since we know the convention that the generic summary has to be in the intro, then when we broke this sentence off, when we broke this off into the next paragraph, we had to keep it in the intro. We didn't transfer it to in the middle of the article. We had to keep it in the intro. If we were to separate it from the introductory paragraph, then it had to immediately follow, just so we can already establish the generic summary. That's how you break a convention. So again, what's the generic summary here? What is it that we're trying to say? Well, we're saying that Parlade's statements are indicative of the policy direction of the government, or Parlade's statements were indicative of the government's attitudes towards combating communism and terrorism. So what does that mean? What do we mean when we say they're indicative? Well, that's something we explain in the body already. So let's go to the body then. Here, we make our first point that Parlade's statements exhibited Mccarthyism. So if you must know Mccarthyism, if you know your history, specifically American history, Mccarthyism was the practice during the Cold War where Senator McCarthy just accused individuals of being communists without proof and launch investigations and a Senate inquiry into them, ruining their careers. So um, that's basically it. When you just it's a fancy word for red tagging, basically. Red tagging by government officials specifically, and especially when they use their government resources and um, yeah, to label these people as communists without proof, especially without proof. So there, we explain what McCarthyism is, and we establish our point that our first point that Parlade has been doing McCarthyism. So, and then we expound on that. What are other examples of McCarthyism? And we also recognize, though, if you can look at the first sentence of um, the second paragraph here, we recognize that cabinet officials, they claim that red tagging is not an official policy. But we also said that even though that may be the case, their practice says otherwise or suggests otherwise. Um, what we meant was that even though it's not an official policy, they nonetheless practiced it. So, and then we enumerated examples to support the first point of McCarthyism. Our second point was that the administration was stirring up a red scare. Now, a red scare is when a government or some influential people they sow fear into the public by saying communists are everywhere. We're saying communist forces have deeply infiltrated society and that they're all over the place. So they're sowing fear of communism by saying, yeah, by saying it's everywhere. So we support that by what supports this actually is the preceding paragraphs. So basically, you can trace how from Parlade's statements to the PNP's anti-communist TARP saying na these um, these organizations are communists. So it's sowing up a red scare. Now, and then we criticize that red scare by saying their claims that communists are everywhere, it doesn't have basis, or at least they weren't able to publicly provide that basis. Now, our third point is hostility. So we say that because of constant red tagging, the government is providing a hostile environment to Filipinos, especially those who dissent to government policies. So then in our conclusion, we give a call to action. So that's in the second line here, second statement. Perhaps now is the time to take the fight to the courts. So why do we think that would be effective? If you compare it, if you draw an analogy, really, so it's an argument by analogy here. In the US, McCarthyism was quashed. It ended because it was challenged in the courts. So perhaps if those people facing this problem can take the fight to the courts, then maybe red tagging would also end. So we're calling to action. Whoever's reading this, if you're affected by this issue, take it to the courts because you have a chance there. So that's how we followed that establish, support, advocate structure in this article, or particularly in the Red Tinted Glasses editorial that we published a few months back. So if I am to summarize that, that would be, what are you trying to say? Intro. Why is that your stand? What can you do? What supports that? And then what now? So what should be done then? What is a good course of action? So what, why, what now? Now, we've talked about structure. We've talked a lot about structure, but another important component of the editorial isn't just the structure, it's also the content itself, what your editorial is actually saying. So, and that's why I'd like to talk about argumentation also, because an editorial really you don't, when you publish opinions, you have to support that opinions, and that's where your argumentation comes in. Mm. So your argumentation would be composed of premises and reasoning, right? What are your supporting statements? What are the uh, reasons why you're taking this stand? Those are your premises. And then your reasoning, how do you connect those reasons together to arrive at your conclusion? So the first thing you have to remember is that your premises should be true. Or if you can't be 100% sure, I mean absolutely with no doubt sure that they're true, then you should at least it should at least be reasonable to think that they're likely to be true. So they're just at least probably true. And next, in terms of reasoning, then your conclusion should validly or soundly follow from your premises. Let's expand on that. So here I have an example of an editorial, an excerpt of an editorial from the Philippine Daily Inquirer. They published this last Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. So the title was Deeper and Deeper into Debt. Um, so that's a big chunk there. It's a big paragraph. If I am to summarize their argument, it's that their premise is that a big portion of the government budget went to debt payment in 2019 and 2020, and actually also it's a big portion is also going to into debt payment in 2021. So what they're saying is that year after year, in a big portion of the budget was to pay off government debt. Um, that's their premise. Their conclusion was that, so therefore, because following recent trends of budget allocation into debt servicing, then the succeeding years will also likely see a big portion of the government budget go to debt payment. And that seems reasonable. That's inductive reasoning. This has happened in the past repeatedly, so it's likely to also happen in the future repeatedly. That's inductive reasoning. That's a sound conclusion. That's a sound argument. Now, we're talking about the premise. So what's their premise here? That a big portion of the government budget went to debt payment in 2019 and 2010. And how do they, what's our assessment of the premise? So this is a very simplified version. If you look at the article, they actually specify that. So in 2019, the government shelled out 842.45 billion. Then in 2020, they shelled out 1 trillion. In 2021, 1.79 trillion is allotted for debt servicing. So if you check that with the General Appropriations Act, for example, or with data from the Department of Finance or the Department of Budget and Management, you can actually check if that's true or not. So assuming that it's true, then okay, they have a true premise. So here we go, all good. Now, but you have to be careful of what premises you use. This is an example of a, this was a statement or a sentence, an excerpt taken from a draft op-ed that I edited. And like I said, op-eds are different from editorials, but they're nonetheless expressions of opinion, right? So argumentation is also important. So what the lesson we can derive here can also apply to editorials. So what they said was, this is part of their premise. They were criticizing the Department of Education after, they were criticizing DepEd for lapses in modular learning or in distance learning. So when they established their newspeg, or when they established the relevance of their article, this is what they said. They cited instances of those recent suicides by students. So what they said was, these are just some of the students who passed away during the pandemic trying to thread distance learning. Now, why is this problematic? Well, this may not be obvious, and I'm not saying, just for the record, I'm not saying that these students definitely did not take their own lives due to distance learning. What I'm saying is that there's no documented proof that distance learning is the cause. Whereas this statement, this premise, is um, declaring, or it's assuming it is true already. It's automatically assuming that it's definitely true that distance learning was the cause. So my comment on this was that, well, I asked, is there any documented proof? Then the writer said that there's no proof, just statements from people. So then those statements were usually um, from progressive groups who were themselves making the claims and who themselves did not provide documented proofs. So what we're doing is just echoing their claims, and we're not really providing something we can be sure of is true, or at least likely true. So you have to be careful. You have to be sure that your premises are, if not absolutely true, then at least likely or probably true. Um, the next part is reasoning, right? So your conclusion has to follow from your premises. So this is um, an excerpt from the editorial titled Young by PDI. This was also a recent one. So let me summarize their argument. Um, by the way, if you can observe, they're using quotes in an editorial. That's not uncommon. In fact, it's even advisable, or maybe even required, because if you take an idea, if any part of your argumentation, like the premise or maybe even the conclusion, if it's taken from somewhere else and it's not your original idea, then journalism ethics, and like it is in academic ethics, would require you to cite your source. So that's why they have here a citation, yeah, an attribution of the quote. So now, what's the premise? The premise is teenage mothers are less likely to finish high school. And so, and that if they're less likely to finish high school, that means they have less income. So there's actually also an implied premise, no, na, if you're less likely to finish high school, then that will lead you to less gainful job opportunities, which will then lead you to have less income. So what's their conclusion? So following from the first premise to the implied premise to the second premise, um, they conclude that because you tend to have less income, then you're more exposed, or you're more threatened by poverty. And because you have less income, you have less money to spend on healthcare. So that follows. Na they're able to establish how, from not being able to finish high school, you're likely to have less income. Again, the connection is because of less employment opportunities. And then from the less income, they connect that to how you're more threatened by poverty and how you have less money to spend on healthcare. So you can see how inductively, again, inductive reasoning, how the conclusion proceeds from the premises. Now, um, what you have to be cautious about in reasoning are fallacies. So I wouldn't want to get into a logic lecture, but I do feel like I have to touch upon common fallacies. Now, these aren't even the most common ones. These are actually less known fallacies that we may nonetheless be susceptible to make. You have, of course, I'm sure you're aware of fallacies like ad hominem, or appeal to emotion, appeal to force, appeal to authority, but I didn't discuss that because those are very obviously fallacies. What I have here are just a few examples of things that are not very common, but we may be unaware of that when we're writing. So one is the red herring fallacy. This is in quotes because this is again an example that I found in an op-ed that I checked, that I edited. So even at our level, right, in college, we're still prone to making fallacies, and we have to be mindful of that if we want to argue, if we want to reason well. So what they said, this isn't in verbatim because they edited this part now. What they said was The police said the protesters violated quarantine guidelines. Yet, why did they not arrest the Bolsinas or Coco Pimentel? Now, what I commented was, I don't want to defend the PNP here, or I'm not saying that the protesters deserve to be arrested, but if we are to analyze this, you can see why it's wrong. It's because the arrest of Sinas or Pimentel has nothing to do with the fact whether the protesters really violated quarantine guidelines or not. Those are separate issues. They're both about violating quarantine guidelines, but whether Sinas was arrested or whether Pimentel was arrested or not, that would have not had any effect on the guilt of the protesters if they were guilty. Um, so that's a red herring. The red herring is when you divert the issue by saying another issue. So it's like saying, so here they talk about the protesters and then they didn't address that. They left that issue altogether and just proceeded to talking about Sinas and Pimentel. So they diverted the issue. Another one is a slippery slope. So um, it's when you say that this event can lead to a series of bad events, inevitably. So for the example I have here is if you criticize the intel funds or the discretionary funds of the president, saying that if you give the president more funds, then it gives him more money, which will inevitably, um, and they can't help it, but they're just going to steal that money. It's going to go into their pockets. What reason have we to believe that it's being corrupted? I mean, surely there's a history of corruption in the government, but that specific portion of the budget, that specific fund, it's a slippery slope to say that it's automatically going to be corrupted or they're going to embezzle those funds. And definitely, like just one event leads to another. When we're making these sorts of arguments, we have to establish why we think that way. If we're saying that the intel funds are being embezzled, then we have to provide proof. We have to provide evidence. And next is something that I call the check your privilege fallacy. This sentence or this statement is common among progressive-minded individuals, right? When you criticize, say, a suggestion or idea, you say, that's anti-poor, so check your privilege. So for example, the one I have here is, those against the pork price ceiling should check their privilege. And then they don't expound on that. They're saying, if you're pro this proposal, you're anti-poor and you're privileged. So this privilege proposal doesn't deserve recognition because it's coming from a position of privilege. But again, you have to assess an argument based on its merits. So if you just say it's a privileged thing to propose this idea without explaining why it's privileged, and without explaining why it's problematic, then that's a fallacy. Next is the ipse dixit fallacy. It's like when you proclaim something as true, even though it's actually not necessarily true or it's arguable. So the example here is that it is undeniably true that most Filipinos are not satisfied with the health crisis management. So it's like you're proclaiming that this is necessarily a fact. This can't be wrong. And yet you don't expound on that because you're already assuming it's wrong. And that's why it's a fallacy, because you're not providing your support. And for this particular example, we know that that's wrong because survey data tells us otherwise, that most Filipinos are actually satisfied with the administration's handling of the pandemic. Next is the false dichotomy. So it's saying there are only two options, so it's either one or the other, nothing in between. So speaking of survey data, the example I have is when people say that either Duterte's approval ratings were fabricated, meaning they were made up, or the people are simply misinformed. So has anyone tried to consider the possibility that people are actually legitimately satisfied with Duterte? So um, it's a false dichotomy to just say those are the only two possibilities. Next is cum hoc ergo propter hoc. Um, with this, therefore because of this. So when you say he died while he was in police custody, so the police killed him. So his death happened with the police, so therefore it was the police that caused his death. Um, you can see how that's problematic because, I mean, yes, there is a spate of police killings, especially during the drug war, but um, if you dogmatically proclaim that that is necessarily true without evidence, then that's the problem. Now, the reason why I discuss this, you don't have to remember the terms or even the specific definitions. I just want you to look at or observe what's common among these. They follow from faulty reasoning. I want you to understand why they are faulty and how they can be made better. So basically, by just supporting your arguments, your um, conclusion has to follow from your premises. Um, and your conclusions, your claims have to be supported. If you're claiming something, if you have to be able to identify when your claim is arguable. So a lot of these claims, a lot of these examples are arguable claims. So for example, the ipse dixit example, that's a claim. You're claiming that most Filipinos are not satisfied. But that's arguable because there's data that can say otherwise. If you're saying that um, he, if you're saying that um, Intel funds are being corrupted, so that's arguable because you have to provide evidence for that. Um, so basically, when you identify which of these things are arguable, then there you have to provide support for it, or at least it has to be reasonably how do I say this? Reasonably has to be reasonable enough that we can believe in it. It has to be reasonably believable or rationally believable. So when you're writing these claims to support or when you're making your argument in an editorial, you have to be able to point out what things need support. And when you're writing those claims, you have to question yourself, is this really something I want to, or is this really something I'm sure of? You have to be sure of what you're saying and that do I have sufficient reason? Do I have sufficient evidence? Or do I have a valid argument or a sound argument to believe that what I'm saying is true or is likely to be true? Um, but another part of your content is not just what you argue or how you argue, but how you persuade. So that's basically your basic ethos, pathos, logos. So that's basic communications theory, right? Your ethos is you establishing your credibility. Your pathos is your you stimulating your reader's emotions, and logos is the use of facts, data, and logic. Now, um, when we talk about credibility in a newspaper, then that's something that's inherent in your paper. Your credibility is to the extent that your readers think you're credible and your readers think you're believable. But ethos isn't just something that's already there, it's also something that can be built. And when you're writing an editorial, how you can build ethos is by using logos. So, for example, when you use facts in your editorial or when you use data to support your claims, and I as a reader, would cross check those facts and data with their source, and I see that you got your facts right, you got your data right, then I would think that you're credible to talk about this because you're getting your facts and numbers right. So using the correct facts and data and also using them in the correct context, interpreting them correctly, lends you credibility. It makes you look like you know what you're talking about. And the same goes for when you're talking about it well. When you're explaining it well. Um, if you explain it in such a way that readers understand and make you look like, or make you as a writer look like you really know what you're talking about, then that gives you credibility. That is ethos. But it also applies to logic. So kanina, we talked about fallacies. So if it so happens that an editorial contains a fallacy and I as a reader spot that fallacy, then I would doubt your credibility. Um, is this person is this, or since the editorial represents the paper, I would doubt the paper's credibility in arguing for this. Does this paper really know what they're talking about? This is faulty reasoning. So I wouldn't think that the editorial or the paper is credible if it uses bad logic. If it does use good logic, and I as a reader would spot that, then yeah, I would agree that the paper is credible to make this argument because its logic is sound, its logic is valid, it uses good reasoning. So let's look at some examples. So ethos really, if there are two parts of ethos, right? In an editorial, it's the credibility inherent in your paper, and it's the credibility that you form when you write or as you write. So the content that you can include are, you can work on directly are pathos and logos. So here are a few examples from the Philippine Star. Here's an excerpt from the recent editorial also by Philstar. So that's from their article Word of Caution. So the pathos here is at the last sentence. It would be a shame to waste a year of sacrifices. It's appealing to the reader's sense not just of shame, but of their sense of um, loss aversion. So as a reader, I'd feel that um, if we had to go back to ECQ again because there is an upsurge in cases, then it would be a wasteful, like what I've had to go through the past year would be wasted. And I'd get this feeling of waste, of loss, that the past year was for nothing. So that appeals to my feeling, that appeals to my emotion. And that appeals to this inherent psychological bias of loss aversion. So that's pathos. Um, so it appeals to you not just emotionally, but also psychologically. Next is logos. So this is from the editorial Spreading Threat by the Philippine Star, also by Philstar. So it's using data. So here it's talking about the new uh, mutations of SARS-CoV-2, of the COVID-19 virus detected in Central Visayas. And it's also talking about the UK variant. So here it said that there have been 62 infections of the UK variant since January 7. Now, and there have been 34 infections of the Central Visayas variant since it was detected. So it's using data to support its claim that the situation is out of hand, or yeah. So how do I, so if we cross-check that with DOH data, then we can see whether it's true or not that there really have been 62 infections or 34 infections of the other variant. So that's logos. Now, so you can use pathos and logos, and depending on how you use logos, you can also effectively create ethos. So the best persuasion combines ethos, pathos, and logos. You rarely see, if you're to ask me based on my experience and based on what I've read, you rarely see an editorial that just uses logos or that just uses pathos. Because if you just use facts, then you'd just be presenting data, and that becomes just that would come across more like an editorial of information, and that's not really argumentative. So, and when you just use facts, the tone tends to be dull. What you really want to be, what you really want in your editorial is something that riles up your readers, something that awakens something in them. So, and that's where pathos can come in. Excuse me. So, when you appeal to their emotions, when you give them a sense of urgency, or when you give them a sense of purpose, give them a sense of um, loss if something is not achieved in time, then you're using and you can effectively push them to do something. So that's where pathos comes in. And it's also a matter of style. So combining logos and pathos just makes your editorial become more or sound more authentic or sound more effective, if you get what I mean. And then from your use of logos and pathos, and ethos can follow. Uh, so if I am to summarize uh, those things that I've just talked about, so your editorial can contain or must contain two important features or characteristics, um, in terms of structure and in terms of content. So in structure, your editorial first has to establish what it's trying to say, support that with arguments, and then advocate for change or advocate for action, whatever action you think is necessary. Then, in terms of content, that's further subdivided into argumentation and persuasion. So, in terms of argumentation, your premises have to be true or are at least likely to be true, and your reasoning has to be valid or sound. Your reasoning, your conclusion has to follow from your premises. You should be able to trace that, and it shouldn't be fallacious. And in terms of persuasion, it's best to combine ethos, pathos, and logos. So let me just end with this. So this is a quote from something I've always kept in my heart, the journalist's creed. Uh, the supreme test of good journalism is the measure of its public service. Like I said, journalism does not exist in a vacuum. Journalism exists in its social context, and in that context, it has its role, its duty as being a seeker of accountability and of being an agent that molds the critical thinking of its readers. So I'm sure a lot of you, as especially English education majors, are when you're on your way to becoming English teachers, you would likely be handling, as mentioned earlier during the opening remarks, you'd likely be handling the newspapers of the high schools that you're going to be work for. And let me just say that one faulty thing I've found in um, uh, high school journalism education is that school paper advisors tend to teach their students that journalism has to be neutral. Let me just say that journalism shouldn't be neutral. You should be fair, you should be impartial, you should be objective, but that's not the same as being neutral. In fact, when you consider the fact that newspapers have an editorial in the first place, and that means they have never been neutral in the first place, and they shouldn't be, because it is their job, after all, to be biased toward the truth and to be and to advocate for what is good for the public and for their readers. And that is why the importance of that was why the editorial is of utmost importance, because it fulfills that role. It effectively um, it its only purpose is to be as a vehicle of public service. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much po, Sir John Emmanuel, for that very full of insightful ideas about editorial writing. Oh, coming from your experiences, I believe that you really have a lot of things to share more than this ano po, webinar workshop. But everything that I've learned from today's workshop is, I think, entirely or most of most of what I thought before is different. Kasi I am a writer before in high school, and I really am not fond of writing editorial writing. But with you discussing about how should I write and what should I write in editorial writing, I've learned a lot po talaga. So thank you so much po, sir.
It's awesome. You're very kind.
And so at this moment, teachers and attendees, if you have questions and clarifications, please use the Google Meet chat box, or you can simply raise your hand here in our meeting if you want to speak. You may place your questions now for our resource speaker. It's your chance, guys, to know more about or to clarify something about you really want to know about editorial writing. Sir, can I start the questioning? I mean, can I ask you one question?
Sure. Fine.
Sir, what do you think is the main challenge or one of the main challenges that writers face nowadays, most importantly in terms of editorial writing po? What do you
Oh,
think is the great challenge po?
remember the thing I call the check your privilege fallacy? That's the that's something we always have to watch out for, because while we as writers have to be careful of when we use that fallacy, um, the audience is sometimes the audience themselves are sometimes too cavalier when they use it. So when they see something in your article that they don't like or doesn't align with their progressive ideals, no matter how valid your argument is for that, or no matter the merits, if they think um, if they find it to be privileged, then they're going to call you out, and it leads to an entire um, it tends to lead us, based on our experience with that controversial editorial I showed earlier. Um, it it yeah, it lends to much, or it leads to much criticism to your paper. It's basically this entire cancel culture that people tend to um, use or tend to operate in, especially when calling you out. The tendency there is that many critics wouldn't read through what you've written and would only cherry pick what they argue against. And that's what we have to be careful about, especially with because well, what we do is when we post editorials on the internet, we are careful with the captions we choose. We are careful with the excerpts of the article that we use as captions, because if we choose something that might be taken out of it might be taken out of context, then um, it's so easy for people to criticize that, and that goes the same for contents of your editorial. Na when you write about this, if you don't provide enough context, people can take that out of context and might criticize you um, unjustly. But of course, there are also times when their criticism, like, against against you being possibly or allegedly privileged, is valid. So, for example, the reason why that skewed representation editorial that I showed earlier, the reason why that was controversial. Now, I would argue that the merits of the editorial were sound, they were valid. In fact, the student government, the president of the student government supposedly said that it was enlightening. But the problem with that was its tone. It didn't it came across as being, as taking the moral high ground. It came across as being insensitive. So no matter how um, well presented the arguments are, if your tone is like that, then it's not going to sit well. So you have to be careful, not just of what you write, but how you present it.
And especially nowadays, our audience now is far more intelligent. I mean, everything that we feed them isn't just really for spoon feeding. Just what you said, it's for call to action. Yun po. There are questions po here in our chat box. The first one is, paano niyo po sinaselect ang topic na gagawa ng editorial?
Yeah. Okay. Let me start by saying our process might be different from others because the editorial is the stand of a newspaper, right? So perhaps there are publications that would first have a meeting with their editorial board, and they would discuss what are the possible things they can write about, and then they would approve it, that this is their topic and that this is their stand. Now, our process, if you're just asking me for our paper, our process is different because we only meet once a month. And our press cycle, for example, for our March issue, our press cycle begins in February. So if we release a paper on March 5, for example, then we have to begin working on the articles by February 5. So it's a long cycle because we only publish once a month, and we only meet once a month. So if we determine the topic at the start, and it turns out that there's a more relevant and more pressing topic in the middle of the month, then we'd have to immediately change. So that setup of determining the topic in a meeting doesn't really work for us. That's why what we do is leave it to the editorial writers. So how it works for us is every month there are editorial board members assigned to write a column, and those editorial board members, they will collectively as a group make the editorial for that month. So it's up to them to decide the topic and then to decide the stand. However, it still goes through editing and proofing, right? So I, as editor-in-chief, am the acting editor of the opinion section. So we don't have an opinion editor. We only have the EIC as the acting editor. So that stand or whatever they write in the editorial nonetheless goes through me. So I check whether their stand is something I believe the Lasallian should stand for. So, but it's not just me who checks it. It's actually all of the top 3 editors. So me, the associate editor, and the managing editor. So we collectively make the decision of whether the stand is fit for our paper or the topic is fit to write about or not.
That's true po. Arduous process pa naman po yung editing talaga. Next one we have here is that hanggang saan po yung role ng advisors sa pagpili at pagsulat ng editorial?
None. Your advisor should be limited to an advisory capacity. You as the editorial board and you as an autonomous you as a paper should be autonomous from any influence of your administration or faculty. The school paper, the student publication, is a publication of, for, and by students. So it should just be the students who work on the internal editorial policies and in the production of content. So only the students should work on the editorial, and any faculty administrator shouldn't be involved. And if you guys do have a faculty advisor or a school paper advisor, as they're called in high school, then they should be just that, advisors. You can ask them whether it's wise to take their stand or not, but ultimately the decision and the content should be entirely up to you.
Sir, in relation po that question is that, here's the question, but what can we do if the school itself ay gusto ipatanggal yung editorial because of her stand? What can we do about that? Or what are the things that we could defend our editorial writing po?
I like that question because that happened to me in high school. I was also EIC in high school, and I got called to the chancellor's office because they didn't like my editorial. Okay, here's the problem. I'm sure we should be protected by the Campus Journalism Act of 1991, right? That's, after all, the basis of the school paper. That's supposedly the law that allows school papers to exist or to function autonomously. unfortunately, it doesn't have teeth. And by that, I mean, if someone is found to be violating that law, for example, if a school doesn't support its school paper, or if a school admin is encroaching on its school paper, there's nothing in the law that says what you can do to take action. Um, at least as far as I know. So that's a tough question because to the extent of my knowledge of the Campus Journalism Act, which is supposed to be the only thing that protects us, there's nothing we can use. I guess what would be wise is to seek the help of external organizations. So people organizations who are um, really supportive of the cause of campus journalism. So you have CGP, you have NUJP. I guess those people will be the ones who are able to provide you with the appropriate support and the supporting mechanism. They will probably know, they'll probably have better advice of what to do. So seek support.
Thank you for that advice, sir. And thank you for answering that little tough question. Here's a medyo tricky question po. Kailangan po ba laging related sa politics ang editorial writing?
Okay. It is tricky. It depends on how I interpret the question. So, first interpretation, if you mean politics, just politics, not necessarily. You can write about social issues that might not involve politics, and we can get into an argument here about everything is political and whatnot. But technically speaking, you don't have to write about government to talk about social issues. You can find a way to write about social issues without talking about government. I mean, somewhere along the line, government will be involved, but you don't have to include them in your article at all if you can find an angle that would fit. But if you mean not just politics, but social issues in general, like I said earlier, technically it doesn't have to be because there are various types of editorials. In fact, you can just celebrate an occasion, you can just discuss a topic, or you can just present a philosophy. But it's advisable that your editorials should relate to socially relevant issues because, again, context is important, and the reason and the purpose of journalism is much more fulfilled, and it's realized when we talk about those issues.
So, should it be sikat or yung dapat pag-usapan lang? Like everything we give opinion about is something that should be relevant and people could relate to, no matter how their economical or status in life are.
So lesson and false dichotomy, it's not necessarily dichotomous, right? It's not only either sikat or either important. So it may be both, and it's best na it's both. But okay, considering a scenario where, because it's possible din naman na something is sikat but not important, but something is also important and not sikat. So it's possible. So considering that scenario, um, I guess if you have to choose between sikat and not important, and important and not sikat, you go with the latter. Because, I mean, no matter how sikat it is, if it's not important, there's really no reason to talk about it. So, for example, um, consider a national newspaper, and its options are the lifting of uh, negative RT-PCR requirement for Cebu tourists, or um, break up ng ganitong celebrity. So, one is sikat, in terms of social relevance, not really that important. One has public implications, but on a national scale, it's not really sikat. So it's more important to talk about the the one with social implications, because I mean, what purpose have you to talk about the celebrities one anyway? What purpose have you to talk about the sikat one if it's not even important? Yeah.
True po, true. I agree with you. Here's, ano po, medyo inspiring. So, any advice for the beginners pa lang po when it comes to editorial writing? So, any advice naman po dyan to upscale our skill in editorial writing?
Ah. Mm, siguro this applies to all writing, but um, don't. I think it would be wise not to expect yourself to get it right the first time. I mean, um, now as a college writer, looking back on my when I read my past articles as a high schooler, it's very cringe. So um, just yeah, don't expect yourself to be at the level you aspire to be immediately. So it's always wise to begin in with simple origins, and you should say try to write an editorial and see what you think is lacking, see what you think is what are the parts you think you should develop more, whether you should develop your structure more, whether you should come up with your own technique, come up with your own style, come up with a tone that fits you or that characterizes you as a writer, um, um, or whether you should develop your reasoning more. So yeah, I think it would be wise to know yourself more, and you can do that by writing first and by assessing yourself, which parts of your writing need improvement, and then practicing. I think I've only been able to get confidence out of editorial writing because I've done it repeatedly. So practicing is a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason because it's what leads you to, better yourself.
We learn by repetition.
Of course, yes.
So, another one, sir, when is this the right time to write out of moral and emotional section?
Um, Anytime can be the right time, really, but just be careful. I mean, as a sense of moral obligation, if you think you have, yeah, as a sense of moral obligation, if you think you need to write about something because it's a moral imperative that you do that you speak up about this issue, then by all means do so. Um, if you think uh, if you're emotionally driven to write about something, then yeah, sure, just be careful to not let such emotion cloud what you're writing about. That you're only using pathos, so to speak. That you're only appealing to emotion. Um, Say if I write about what's an issue now? Sorry, daming issue. Di ako makapili. Say you write about the vaccination program, and you're very frustrated that we still don't have vaccines. So then you're going to go on a rant that this government is irresponsible, they're not caring for the poor, blah blah blah, and yet to go on an emotional spree without presenting any facts or any data that might enhance uh, your argument. So that's where the fault comes in. So it's never wrong to write out of moral and emotional suction. Just don't write purely with it. Uh, Supplement with valid reasoning and use of facts and data.
Well, I mean, we shouldn't always, or it goes to the point again that we should never allow our emotions to get ahead of us. So, for the last question po, as future school teacher advisors, what are your final message for us given the aforementioned issues regarding control of high school publications?
Oh, yeah. I'm actually reading the chat. If you don't mind, before I answer that question, I found another question. I think you might have missed it by mistake.
Yeah, I missed that po. Sorry.
Okay.
You can answer po.
What are the strengths and weaknesses of editorial writing? Um, huh. Well, strengths, of course, is that it sways your readers. It molds their critical thinking, and um, it like I've said repeatedly, it fulfills the role of journalism. And um, if you are in the right, if your if your opinion is um, in the right side of things, whatever side that may be, then you can sway your readers to the right side. Um, Weaknesses, it's not really a weakness. I can't think of one that are weaknesses per se, but more like limitations. Since your editorial has to be concise, otherwise it drags on so long that your readers might not care to finish it even. So since you have to be concise, then it may limit what you can say. So if you're writing about a very nuanced topic, you might not be able to write about every nuance in that topic. You just have to select ones which are most relevant and um, which are most useful to you. So yeah, because of the conciseness, it's a that poses a limitation. Maybe another, not really a weakness again, but another thing you have to watch out for is what you're swaying your readers into. So if you're swaying them to be for or against this proposal, or for example, if you're swaying them to be against charter change, or you have to have moral justification that you're swaying them to the right side of things. If not, if what you're swaying them to is not a morally justified side, then um, that's a drawback of the power to sway. So it's as if you've used your power to influence people in the wrong way. So that's a drawback when you're writing opinions. Uh, or at least something you have to watch out for. Uh, so now moving on to that final question. Um, for one, something I wish I'd received uh, as a high school writer dati. Um, I mean, I recognize that in my later years, our SPAs were supportive, but I wish it was like that all throughout high school. Um, yeah, be supportive of your writers, of your um, publication staff. Um, Now you know naman the limitations of being an advisor, so please don't encroach upon their editorial independence. Um, you please also provide them with guidance. So guidance is different from doing the work for them or um, controlling their work. And please provide them with um, please defend them because as an SPA, you may clash with um, admins, especially high school admins. They're very onion skinned. Um, you may clash with admins who might not be in favor of what your editorial is trying to say, especially if it's critical of the school. So the advisors, as people trained in journalism, should be the first line of defense when their publication staff are threatened. Um, so please, just if I'm to put it simply, please just be there for your publication. Um, and when you teach them journalistic philosophy, again, I'd like you to. It would be nice if we could do away with the whole paradigm that journalism is neutral. From the very start of journalism, it has never been neutral. It's a whole historical issue we can talk about when journalism became neutral. But in our current context, we have to shift away from that mentality because um, only through recognizing the role of journalism as being critical, journalism has to be critical towards those in power. Journalism has to um, seek what is best for its readers. So journalism cannot be neutral. So if you could teach your kids that, that would be great. We would be um, properly educating the next batch of campus journalists. Yeah.
I think hindi naman po ganun naging problema because students nowadays, as per my experience, as based on my experience, are proactive and they really want their voice to be heard. Well, sometimes it goes to show that um, we are so aware of our society, but it also shows that we want to be heard and the youth of today really wants to be part of our, not just in our society as students, but also individuals who would always want for changes. So, hey, leave it at, leave that to us po. Sure. And
High hopes for everyone.
yeah, thank you po, sir. So, um, again, we're very truly thankful for the time and skills you've shared us. And thus, allow me to award you the certificate of recognition to show our gratitude and appreciation. Let me first read the citation. Certificate of Appreciation. This certificate is hereby given to Mr. John Manuel M. Alonso for sharing his time and expertise as a resource speaker and facilitator during the conduct of the workshop with the theme Voice Out, Empowering Young Voices Through Editorial Writing, virtually given this February 2021. Signed by Mr. Roy Vincent M. Montenegro, the president of the Faith Teachers League, Dr. Jerilyn D. Maguo, chair of the College of Education and advisor of the Faith Teachers League, and Dr. Vivian B. Titular, the dean of the College of Education.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Foster. So, guys, this wouldn't be a perfect workshop if we cannot do something that would really test the things that we've learned through Sir Johnny Manuel. And so, guys, please allow me to read to you the mechanics and guidelines for our editorial writing contest. First one, only bona fide Faith College of Education students on the school year 2020-2021 can join the contest. The topic to deal with is, according to sir, it's about the LUMAD schools. Am I right, sir?
The recent police raid in the Lumad school in Cebu.
Yeah. Thank you po. And then, the medium should be in English, since we are English teachers. The submissions must have a minimum of 1 page and a maximum of 3 pages. And the font to be used can either be Arial or Times New Roman in 12 with a spacing of 1.15, 1-inch margins on all sides, and a letter size paper of 8.5 by 11. Submissions of the entries will be on the February 23rd in 2021 from 4 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. Guys, it is only for today and only through the submissions would be passed in this link, as you can see in the screen. And please use your faith email when submitting. And lastly, 5 best editorials will be selected and shall win 200 pesos each. So the winners will be announced in the FPL official FB page. And for the criteria of judging, the title will have a 10%, 20% for stand, 50% for the content with evidence, and 20% for structure and organization, a total of 100%. So guys, I encourage you to pass your editorial outputs so that we wouldn't just know what are the things you've learned from Sir Manuel, but it would also give you the opportunity to learn what are your what are your skills and your strengths in writing an editorial output. And yeah, of course, to give you a short happy moment of this webinar workshop, hindi tayo uuwing luhaan. Hindi tayo magiging ligwa kasi magkakaroon tayo ng 5 winners in our raffle draw. So, please roll it na. I won! Mine po! I won! Ayun guys, if ever you're present, kapag nandun yung pangalan niyo sa relata and nanalo kayo, just chat mine. So, another one. We have 4 left. Okay, we have the second one. Congratulations, Mr. Paul Darrell Gumba. You won Pathos. Comment mine po or chat mine if you're okay. The next one we have Miss Sterlene Maril Ison. Are you there, Sterlene? Oh, she's not. Ayan, she commented mine. And then we have Miss Angelica Ramirez. Ate Aika, are you there? Please comment mine po. Yan. Congratulations po, Ate Aika. And then for the last one, our last lucky winner in our raffle draw. Congratulations, Miss Lailane Varela. Are you there, Ate po?
Mine po.
Ayan, bye! Yay! Congratulations to all the winners of the raffle draw. Ayun, guys. So, yun. Sabi ko naman sa inyo, walang uuwi ng ligwak. So, guys, just a few reminders lang. Attendees are encouraged to fill out the evaluation form and to submit their entries on the contest. The links shall be provided by the committee, as you can see on the chat box on our Google Meet. So the form will serve as the attendance to know who are the participants of the program. Hence, failing to do so will hinder you from getting your certificate of participation. So again, guys, in-encourage namin kayo na mag-fill out ng evaluation form and to submit all your entries. Nandiyan na po yung link. Fill upan nyo na lang po and then magsaserve po yung form as attendance to know who are the participants of the program. Sayang naman po yung yung attendance nyo and yung certificate. So please fill it out. And so to officially end this webinar workshop, a round of virtual applause to the Vice President Internal of the Faith Teachers League, Ms. Laurelyn Austria, for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon po. First of all, to express my gratitude to all of you for attending our seminar workshop. We truly appreciate your presence and, of course, your participation in our event. I would like to thank as well our team, the organizers of this event, and other FTL officers who made efforts to make this event happen. Also, to our very supportive Chair and Dean, Dr. Geraldine Magbuo and Dr. Vivian Titulor. Thank you so much po for your non-stop support and being there always to guide and help us in every activity po that we do. And of course, I personally want to thank as well our speaker, Mr. Alonzo, for saying yes to share his knowledge and giving us his time and effort to make this truly a successful one. It is indeed po very insightful, just like what Karen said earlier, no? And a big help for us, especially for English majors, since this is a good start for those students who will be introduced in the field of journalism. So that will be our first and second year students, no? Since we third year students po already took the journalism course, so this is just to refresh our learnings with regards to how to properly write an editorial article and what are the techniques to be utilized. Moreover po, this is actually one of our future jobs din to become a school paper advisor. And yun nga, sabi din ng advisor ko, ay ng professor ko back then sa journalism. And of course, as a future teacher, as a future English teachers, we will not just teach the students the skills to close read, but of course, we will teach them about advanced reading, advanced writing, and we are very often to seek out careers just like, of course, teaching, advertising, in public relations, sa media din, and of course, sa publishing. Like, yun nga, pwede tayo maging copywriter, editor, columnist, reporter, or technical writer, author, and such. And that's why this is indeed a great opportunity for all of us to know how to properly write an editorial article. As we will teach this then sa ating mga future students, and yun nga, sabi ko nga kanina, this is also our future job. So this is a great opportunity then to practice the skills na. So before I end this, I just want to leave a quote for all of you. No? This is by Arthur Brisbane. Writing good editorials is chiefly telling the people what they think and not only what you think. So that's it. Thank you so much po for attending our seminar, and God bless you all po.
Thank you so much, Ms. Laurelyn, for that touching closing remarks. And so at this point, I would like to request everybody to open their cameras for a photo op. Yeah, it's time to show all your beautiful faces, everybody. Okay, guys. Turn on po tayo ng ating cameras para po makita tayo. Yan. Pa-fresh! Okay. And in 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay. One more pa po ba? Okay. Okay. So, yan. Everyone, please turn on your... You can turn it off na po if medyo na-awkward kayo. So, please turn on your microphones for the singing of the Faith Hymn.
This land, cradle of heroes, fervently burns a bright light of hope. Knowledge and wisdom that will flourish, that will nurture the future of this nation. when we bless you, glory, oh, faith. Ikaw ay may kong bandila mo, dahil sa kadakilaan mo, ilalahad kong mga aral mo, isisigaw ko, oh faith, napakailanman. Isisigaw ko, oh faith, napakailanman. Oh, napakailanman.
And so everybody, please turn on your microphones for our battle cry. Ad Astra,
First
Asia.
First Asia.
First
Asia.
Thank you po.
And that's it. Thank you, guys. That has been our voice out, empowering young voices through editorial writing. So I hope you've learned a lot and you will submit your entries to our editorial writing contest. And of course, I would also want to thank again Mr. Jean Emmanuel Alonzo for gracing us your time and your expertise for today's workshop webinar. Thank you po again, and thank you for attendees. Thank you po, Ms. J, for guiding us in this workshop webinar. So once again, I'm Karen Erlaza Mendoza, your host for today, and see you soon, guys.